I'll talk about lunar surface composition in the context of this meeting. So the composition of the moon has been measured using various techniques for more than 50 years, but the poles are still a place where we have not been to. And so most of what we know is based on a kind of extrapolation from the models that we have for the other places. So that's what I am trying to say here, and some new measurements that we have from an X-ray fluorescence experiment on Chandrayaan-2. So in the context of this meeting for LGWA, why is geochemistry important? Because primarily, this is an important aspect of understanding the regolith properties. So just like any material science, what is regolith made of? What are its components? Because lunar regolith is very different from what you find in any other planet, especially for geologists who study terrestrial, soil or regolith. So regolith is basically unsorted mixture of things which can be, of scales from microns to a few centimeters. So it's basically a kind of debris, and particularly on the moon, because there is no atmosphere, the surface has been battered for billions of years by big impacts in the early era and later on with micrometeorites. So what you find is a very fine layer of soil, you can call that soil, very fine layer of lunar soil, and what you call the regolith. So it's covered with in some 10 to 15 meters with this kind of regolith. So what you measure using any technique is just this. But this is representative basically of the crust that is deeper. And when you go inside impact basins or craters, you expect to measure some material from the deeper, which has been emplaced there by those impacts. And what we know today is largely from the return samples. We know there's been these Apollo missions, the Lunar, and recently the Chang'e 5 return samples. So what we know about the moon is the geochemical part is basically from all this data. So when you say geochemistry, what you mean is what is the elemental abundances. So all the terrestrial planets are made of these basic elements, refractory elements like magnesium, aluminum, silicon, up to iron. But what proportion are these in the lunar soil is important to understand the origin and evolution of the moon. So that's what we want to know when we say lunar geochemistry. And this is primarily done in lab using return samples. And the next step is, of course, there is remote sensing techniques, but real geochemistry is usually done with the return samples. And as you know, this is done only for a very small areas in the moon. And if you compare all of them, you see that there's quite a lot of diversity. This understanding is necessary if you want to set up any long-term working environment. So we are talking about placing these detectors for a few years on the surface of the moon. So it is necessary to know, what is the working environment that we are in. So understanding regolith properties is a major part of that. Just to give an example, the thermal conductivity, for example, would depend on the composition, right? So if you want to know how temperature changes are happening, how the payload temperatures change. So part of this design is also understanding the changes in the regolith, which is connected to composition. The resource availability for a sustained exploration. So when you talk about in situ resource utilization on the moon, basically you are trying to see what can we extract from the surface, which is again from the regolith, and what elements or minerals it contains. The composition and model petrology would affect thermal properties of the bulk regolith. For example, there is a model given in this reference here. So really, if you want to have like in LGW a place where the thermal stability is really very, within very stable temperatures, you also need to have a good model on that, which means you need to understand the regolith properties, including composition. And there is also this case that the poles of the moon, as we know today, contains more volatiles like water. And there are even other volatiles that we talk about today, perhaps methane or H2S, some of these which has been measured by the L-cross impact experiment that was done some years ago. So where we know it's not just water, there are other volatiles that we talk about. And it is related to the geochemistry. Like there is a cycle on the moon, as we know today. Like if you take the case of water, you know, it changes with diurnal cycle on the moon, changes with seasons. So the retention of these volatiles on the surface grains or deeper inside do depend on the geochemistry. So in the context of this meeting, this is what we want to know when we say composition. How do we measure composition? Apart from getting those samples here, which are very expensive missions, and we can't possibly do this for every part of the moon. So we largely rely on remote sensing techniques. There are three major ways in which usually it's done. The IR reflectance spectroscopy, where you look at the reflected sunlight from the surface of the moon, and there are certain features that tells you about what kind of transitions are happening, which will help you detect the dominant mineral. The spectral parameters are often used to infer the chemical composition. Gamma ray spectroscopy is widely used primarily for radioactive elements. There is natural radioactivity in some of these elements, which help you map its abundance on the surface of the moon. And the galactic cosmic rays interact with the surface of the moon, and through a series of nuclear transitions, give you lines in gamma rays, which are again used to measure primarily iron and titanium is what is being mapped using the Lunar Prospector gamma ray spectrometer. And currently the Korean orbiter has a new gamma ray spectrometer, so probably they'll come up with new results. And lastly, the X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy is a very established technique, which first flown in the Apollo 15 and then 16 missions. And subsequently, there's been the ESA Smart One had a D-kick spectrometer, Chandrayaan-1 had a kick spectrometer. So these were all towards mapping X-ray fluorescence lines from the surface of the moon, which you can model and get abundances from. So we have a experiment called class. So before I get into class, just wanted to go into the composition at the poles, what's being done. So this is an example of the 1 micron band depth using the moon mineralogy mapper in Chandrayaan-1. So if you see the poles, so one major thing is in the South Pole, where most of the landing missions are planned, including, if we have a concept, LGWA detector. So the South Pole is a prominent place of interest. You see that this part of the South Pole, which here what you see, you have more mafic material, which now, if you look at it in a geological context, you understand that there is a big basin on the far side of the moon called the South Pole Attican Basin. So most of the material here comes from SPA's impact. So basically what you see is that you cannot just, extrapolate composition from other areas to just talk about the poles. You do have to look at it specifically in the geological context, and modeling is not really sufficient to understand the composition here. So often in many of the lunar origin and evolutionary models, you use basically some average compositions for the crustal regions, something for the mare basalts, but because of these recent measurements, which high resolution that's been done more globally, we today understand that specific areas do require compositions that you need measurements to be done specific to the location and cannot be just extrapolated from it. And for the case of the moon, the geological context is a very important parameter to also infer composition. Like in this case, you need an explanation which is coming from the fact that this is an ejecta that's probably been part of the big impact that's happened on the far side. And the North Pole, you see a different distribution. So the red here means more mafic material, which is from the, below the crust. And the blues are representative of a crustal composition. So this is what you see at the poles using the moon mineralogy mapper. So this is from the gamma ray spectrometer on Lunar Prospector. Here the iron maps are more uniform in the North Pole with a slightly higher iron towards the higher latitude. So this is cut at the 60 degree. And again, if you come to the South Pole, as a result of this SPA basin being on the far side, again, there is more higher ion in this side. So the landing site that you choose here and where you place your detectors, the regolith properties probably have to be considered looking at these diversities that you see. Class is the X-ray experiment on Chandrayaan-2. It measures lunar X-ray fluorescence. So those are the detectors. These are a variation of X-ray CCDs called swept charge devices, and we have 16 of them. It's a continuation again of DKICS that was on Smart 1, followed by KICS and class. So this time, because Chandrayaan-2 has been there for more than 3 years now, and the sun is active, so we have had a good coverage in X-rays. And so we can say that this is one of the largest coverage in X-rays and highest spatial resolution elemental maps. I'll just stick to some preliminary results. So one thing is, if you get to the poles, the solar angles are of grazing incidence. So you can imagine, because of the curved surface of the moon, you have very low sun angles at the poles, so the signal is inherently weak. So in this, we've plotted those signals which are at 3 sigma detection. So that's why the coverage is sort of sparse here. So to be on the safer side, we've just taken only the 3 sigma detections of the X-ray lines here. So this is, for example, the magnesium map from class. And you can see that in the North Pole, where there is coverage, you see this magnesium higher towards the 70-degree, and even in some of these 80-degree areas. So we don't really get signal at the very close to the poles. This is the South Pole. And here again, this is the far side. So you see that higher magnesium, which could be connected to the, again, it's here, I think, sorry. You see some of these higher magnesium here. So basic thing is that this is the first magnesium map that's been made of the moon, because magnesium is not an element that is easily quantified with any of the other methods. So because X-ray fluorescence is a very direct method for magnesium, so this is the first kind of such a map. And so we are seeing this at the poles, which actually shows that there's quite a diversity with the darker regions showing higher magnesium. So this is a very preliminary result. So, but just the scope for looking at polar composition given these new maps. And so aluminum is a major element in the crust. So when you talk about lunar crust, primarily you look at aluminum abundances, because that is what is contained mainly in the mineral called plagioclase, which is the most dominant, the bright regions on the moon that you can see with the naked eye is basically plagioclase. So even on the polar regions, you expect the dominant mineral to be this plagioclase series, which contains aluminum. But what you see here is that it's not, again, like really very uniform, which means there is scope for more research on the polar composition really. For South Pole here, you see some of these lighter areas, which means there's probably a mixture of more iron containing minerals. So I'm just talking about this because you really don't have any idea of polar composition. Because you don't have samples from them. So these are the best things that you can do about it. And these new maps provide you with an independent data set to look at this more carefully. So these are, again, iron abundances. So these are the major elements that are in the minerals on the moon. So a comparison among them is what tells you about the geochemistry. So again, iron abundance here, you can see the diversity. So basically the take home point is that take any element, you just see that it's not just a uniform composition in the poles. There is difference between the North and the South Pole. There is also a diversity that you see, across the poles. That's a sodium abundance, was newly mapped with class, because again, sodium is not detected with any other technique. And its importance is because it's moderately volatile. So like water, this is an important element to trace and see, because you lose it to the exosphere. So there is a cycle on the moon. So that was an important element to be mapped. And with class, we do that. Again, because it's a weak line, you have very few points, but Primarily, we see that at the poles, its abundance is quite high, just like for water, um, which means that there's certainly, as we know today, there is more volatile deposits that's happening at the poles, and there is a cycle to it. So when we talk about any site on the surface at the poles, you also need to know this dependence on the diurnal cycle, the temperatures, because some of these things do change over the years and in a month. So what we have is that a summary of the maps is that there is high aluminum abundance at the poles with more homogeneity at the North Pole than the South. High magnesium and iron abundances. It coincides with the higher 1 micron band depth in M3. Sodium is higher at the poles, and there is a time dependence, which shows that volatile nature is being evident here. These class maps provide a new independent data set for geochemical measurements. And so I'll stop with the summary. The composition of the polar lunar regolith basically is largely unknown. The geological setting of the South Pole suggests possible mafic materials from the South Pole Attican Basin. So there is an asymmetry there if you go to the far side or the near side. The in situ sampling or sample return is necessary for a detailed understanding. So on Chandrayaan-3, you have an X-ray experiment, but that goes to about 60 to 70 degree that latitudes, but not really to the poles. So unless you really have an in situ sampling at the poles, a detailed understanding is going to be difficult. The Chandrayaan-2 class indeed provides the first high resolution elemental maps of the moon, and you have coverage up to 80 degrees and in some cases to 85. So this is the next best thing that we can do to look at a detailed understanding of the polar compositions. I'll stop at that.
Thank you very much, Shyama. It's a very nice talk, and we do have time for questions. We'll start. So what are the near-term prospects of in situ sampling on
yeah, so we have these CLTS Artemis missions. So they have NIR spectrometers, which is going to give you probably the first spectra in these regions. And most of the missions will have some compositional experiments that being planned. So even the ISRO JAXA mission that we have aims to have a very detailed sampling at the South Pole. There are sophisticated instruments on the LUPEX mission that is going to do that. Yeah, so that is the.
Weren't they limited by the fact that you only do a local measurement?
That is right. Yeah, so that is right. But
you're finding that there is significant variation.
There is. So that even with the Apollo missions, among them, there's quite a lot of difference. But yeah, that's the next best thing to do.
Is there some kind of a possibility of doing some kind of combined modeling where you have some spectroscopy for the global variation and then precise measurements at some.
Yeah, so often remote sensing measurements are normalized with ground truth points by looking at that, but the scales are really different. So to first order, it would work, but for the kind of understanding that you need to have a permanent base on the moon and have sustained experiments happening for a long time, I think you would need a more detailed understanding. So that's often when, say, if you choose a site for LGW payload, probably you need a very detailed understanding of that site from the nearest mission that can go there. So I think such detailed modeling is really required. Thank you.
I'm trying to get a feel for the surface of the moon and how, as you say, there is some rubble, most of it rubble and gravel, and some sandy material. I suppose that's the picture of a regolith. It's broken rock of some sort.
Yeah.
And beneath, and you say, what's the average thickness of this rubble? Like, is it like several tens of meters or?
Yeah, so 10 to 15 meters.
10 to 15 meters.
It varies across the moon, so more on the far side.
And when there is an exposed crater, which is relatively recent, do we see some hard surface, or is it still rubble all the way?
So it still would be the top regolith. You don't really reach the crust.
Of course, the crust would be bedrock.
Several kilometers.
Is there a distinction between bedrock and crust?
Right. Yeah, so fractured bedrock.
Okay.
Because still it has the impact features on it, and then the crust. I mean, we do not know whether there is
How
any
deep that is?
unfractured crust, maybe some 25 or deeper
I
down.
see. So when a lander lands and roves around on the moon, it's mostly on the rubble. There is never a hard rock.
But when reading on how these the vehicles have moved, it's fluffy at the top, but it's still hard. And as far as I know, the drilling experiments have found it really hard to drill. So it is really
okay. So
hard.
it's
not
loose
just
soil.
very, very loose throughout. So
Okay.
the very top may be a bit fluffy, but deeper it is.
All right, thanks.
So my question is probably to both of you and Jan. So maybe you have discussed this already. So if I understand correctly, for the lunar mission to work with the seismic detectors, you need to know how much are the anisotropic stress components created by the gravitational waves which are falling on the moon, right? For that, you would need a very precise geological mapping of the part. So is there any estimate that how accurately or precisely those geological modeling need to be done? And is it achievable with the present kind of experiments which are being done?
Yeah.
Maybe the first comment I can make. So it's not that you need to be very precise, for the planning, let's say, of what you can do with such a detector. I think you don't have to be extremely precise with your geological model first. Later on, it becomes important when you have to calibrate your data, actually. So at that point, you have to find out a way to really understand the geology in extreme precision, which I guess you will not ever get out of any of these measurements. So these measurements, I think, are very important for the planning of LGBA. But later on, when you really want to do the calibration step of the data, then you have to go way beyond that. And we have to still invent some mechanism. I think, so my initial idea is always we use gravitational wave signals actually to understand the geology and then be able to refine our calibration of our data later on. Because I don't know, I mean, I'm not an expert, of course, of any of these measurements, so I don't know how precise, because we need that information also, let's say, down to 50 kilometers underground. So, it's not just, the first 100 meters, but really we have to go deeper into the moon with these models. And so I don't know how precise of information we can get from geologists and so on.
Meaning what I mean is that, see, on the earth, we know that there are people like Surendra who does this kind of geological modeling using the terrestrial data. So they would know how much accuracy you need, what kind of measurements you need on the earth to do it. So they could also say that how much meaning what kind of measurements you need on the moon, right? So that can be fed back and then you could see. So I agree with you that, initially maybe with some of the loud gravitational wave events, you could do a calibration of the detector and then try to get the signal out. But on the other hand, there should be some long-term goal that, okay, maybe you start the observations now, but that in 10 years time, enough measurements would be done on the moon so that you can get, much more precise, because you don't want to only detect the ones which are the known signals. When you are proposing a mission, you want to detect the unknown signals, which cannot be calibrated that way, right? So that will require maybe the proper geological modeling.
Yeah, just to explain, so the way we need geological models right now is that we have to put the elastic properties of the moon, which are certain material parameters, into finite element simulations, and then get out, for example, response of the moon to gravitational waves and all of that. So that is the information we need. And yeah, some of that is already coming out of course, there are also people in Paris expert on this. So some of this we are getting already out of Apollo data and new data coming in. but that has to be far better than what we have at the moment. So I think in the next years, there is already more information for us to refine these models, but then all of that is not going to be accurate enough to really calibrate at a percent level gravitational wave response. I think that has to be invented yet, you know, how to do that.
Just following up to, but since you have a reference, wouldn't that differential signal help? Would you really require more precise geological model because you're doing this with reference, right?
Yes. So what was the question? If
no, so I'm just thinking of data. So since you have a reference,
yes,
wouldn't it become easier since the response would be the same with the for the response as well as the gravitational wave?
well,
so you're probably looking at a differential. That's what I understood. So like, okay, so the moon is, moon is responding to a gravitational wave, and you have something on the surface, which is, and you take a reference, I thought, right?
the reference.
To pick the gravitational wave itself, you do have a reference standard?
He's trying to say that when there is no gravitational waves, you have certain reference measurement of the detector, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah.
And when the gravitational wave arrives, there is a change in the measurement in the seismometers. Is that how it is being done? I think then you may not need so much precise measurements of the geology. Meaning what I understand she's saying is that you see a change, but you don't know the exact calibration. Can that give you a detection?
Yeah, it's a question.
No, I think you need absolute calibration. So you need, and so I think, you know, the real problems in the end is, so for example, if you know what type of gravitational wave is coming in, then you can, of course, for example, let's say translate, you know, because then you have different frequency scales and different, which translates into different length scales of your geology, which matter. And at that point, you can, for example, if you know what type of signal it is, you can use very accurate large-scale understanding to calibrate actually your small-scale geology understanding. So, you know, because if you, for example, have a very good calibration for your gravitational wave signal at the millihertz, because you just need the very large-scale structure of the moon, and you know what type of signal it is, then you know what amplitude that signal then has at all the other frequencies. And that allows you to calibrate, you know, to infer the geology very, very precisely up to very, very small scales. And so I think these are the ideas that we have to pursue. The real complication is that it might actually depend on from where the gravitation wave comes. So it is, you know, it might be because there might be some kind of anisotropies in the moon. So all this calibration procedure will have to be done with many signals and so on. But eventually you will arrive at a model of the moon, which will be super precise coming out of the gravitational wave signals.
Yeah, in that case, is there some estimate back of the envelope that kind of precision is possible to achieve in the future, or you would really need, let's say hundreds of high SNR detections in order to, even if that is the case, how would you do the calibration exactly? Meaning, has that been thought through? Meaning, like you put up some kind of matrix, and then a gravitational wave comes, then you see that whether you can derive that sort of coupling matrix, or let's say stress tensor type object.
Yeah, so I think there should be a PhD thesis about that. No, I think it's a few years project to really understand that. Yeah.
So maybe now it's a good time to break for coffee and continue this discussion over coffee. So we will thank you, Shyama, for this very nice talk.